The Legal Corner podcast series. Welcome to today's episode of The Legal Corner, a podcast which covers a variety of legal issues to keep you informed. Hosted by attorney at law Colin Dinoon and communications specialist Leonardo Torres.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the Companies Registry, the CROS System. And our distinguished guest today is Mr. Sheldon Paul Mycoo. Just to tell you a bit about him, he's a dynamic individual, businessman, entrepreneur, business development consultant, former financial advisor, certified forensic accounting specialist in asset misappropriation and fraud detection, and attorney at law. He has an inbuilt, continually expanding capacity to conceptualize, discern, unearth, cross-fertilize ideas or concepts, and devising solutions, all in the pursuit of the best desired outcomes for individual clients and firms alike. He has diverse practice areas in law, criminal, civil litigation, tax, conveyancing, corporate and commercial, probate, employment. Other areas, business development, consultancy, accounting, and financial services. Good day to you, Sheldon, and welcome to Legal Corner.
Hey, Colin. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Lovely. Sheldon, we're going to get right into it. I want you to give us an overview of the different types of business structures and their advantages and disadvantages.
Well, in answering that question, Colin, I always like to refer to the law, because the law forms the foundation upon which we do anything. Generally, we tend to use the term business for more or less all types of business structures interchangeably. But the law specifically defines business as business under the Business Registrations Names Act. And companies, which is another term we tend to use for business, under the Companies Act. So in establishing that distinction, I would say that the Business Registration Act allows you to register a business name or a doing business as name or a trade name that you're functioning under. Under that Business Registrations Names Act, the structures usually would be the sole trader registration, partnership registration, and a firm to be registered as a firm. On the other side of it, we also now have the Companies Act, which allows you to register different structures, limited and unlimited liability companies. Limited liability companies, for-profit and not-for-profit. There are unlimited liability companies. There are external companies as well. But I will focus my attention primarily on the three business structures: companies limited, companies limited, for-profit, companies limited, not-for-profit, sole trader, and partnership. Now, in the context of advantages and disadvantages, under the Business Names Registration Act, sole traders and partnerships are a lot easier to form in that there's much documentation that is required to establish those business structures. And it's a lot cheaper. And so that's one of the major advantages. The difficulty as well is with that advantage, it comes some disadvantages in that in the eyes of the law, those types of registrations, they make no distinction between the business and the owner. So in the eyes of the law, it's one single person trading as or doing business as. And in those circumstances, you are exposed to the benefits, so you enjoy all the profits, but you are also exposed to all of the liabilities. All right? And so, again, to get registered, it's fairly quickly, but you have that major disadvantage. What that means, basically, is that all of your personal assets are exposed to litigation in the context of if you are ever sued or found to be negligent in any way. They could basically come for the clothes on your back. And so that's a major disadvantage. Most of the times, persons who are risk averse would tend to go with limited liability companies. And it's a lot more complicated to register a limited liability company. It has a lot more advantages, I believe, than those types of structures under the Doing Business Act or the Business Registrations Act. Companies for profit with limited liability protection. Some of the features are they are independent, legal, and tax structures separate from their owners. Additionally, there is no limit in terms of the number of owners to that particular business, as well as there is protection in that your liability, you more or less ring fence your liability because of that separateness between the owner and the company. Your personal assets are not exposed to liability. The advantages of forming a limited liability company would be in that you have the benefit of bringing in a number of directors, a number of shareholders. You can utilize it for raising or attracting finance. You can utilize it for investment purposes, personal asset protection, succession planning, and so forth. And it also gives you an additional credibility in the eyes of the consumer out there that you are a limited liability. There's some type of prestige that's often associated with those types of companies. Persons are more likely to give credit because in the event that something was to happen to the individual owner, the advantage is that limited liability will continue because, again, it's separate and distinctly apart from the owner. And so, and there's one other major advantage. I believe limited liability companies have access to government tax shelters. So, for instance, in the tax code, which will be our Corporation Tax Act, there are provisions for deductions for investments in film, sport, art and culture. So there are some serious tax benefits for limited liability companies. And that's more or less it in a nutshell. Which one you choose when speaking to clients, I always advise that you need to know where you're going and how fast you want to get there. And depending on the answers for that, I then advise which corporation structure or which business structure, I would recommend. And that's it more or less.
Well, you have touched on the main advantage, I would say, to incorporating a company, which is that concept of separate legal personality, whereby the owner's assets are separate and apart from the assets of the company, and therefore their assets are protected in the event of any sort of litigation that may be mounted against the company. So I think that is really one of the key benefits.
It's one of the key, but there are some limitations to that, in that it's not impenetrable, in that even that you are found to be negligent in any way, you can pay a corporate bill. So essentially, that separate and distinct legal entity, in the context of that separateness, is one of the major benefits of having a company. Right? In the context of transferring assets, so for instance, somebody may want to start a business for business purposes, and it's a type of legacy that they want to establish a family business that they could pass on to the children and so forth. I would always recommend a limited liability company because, again, those companies outlive their owners. They could live in perpetuity. So you could use it for transferring assets. If you purchase assets in the name of the company, whether it be a house, a car, other types of assets, you can perhaps set up a trust so that the beneficiaries, which would be your children and wife and so forth, could then benefit long after you've gone. And so it's a way of...
Sheldon, let's get over to the CROS system now. And I want you to tell us what led to the genesis of the CROS system.
Right. So again, nothing exists in a vacuum. From a local perspective, we would have moved from a exclusively manual system with filing documents over the counter and so forth. As far back as 2009, there were some advancements in the development of the TT BizLink system, which saw us now being able to register companies online. And that was working, but there were also some developments in that there were loopholes in the system in the context of fraud, in context of what we call oppression actions that come in civil litigation for companies, where directors were unaware of what was happening in the business. And so shares were being transferred unawares to shareholders. And so only when the matter would have been investigated, it ends up in court. And so there were a lot of loopholes there in terms of reporting conditions for the tax authorities and so forth. It was difficult to find who owned companies and so forth. And so from in that perspective, the system operated that way. But internationally, Trinidad and Tobago, we found ourselves in a situation where the G7 countries, G20 countries would have classified Trinidad and Tobago and a number of Caribbean jurisdictions as tax havens. And so there has been a drive towards eradicating tax evasion and money laundering and combating of terrorism. And so there were a number of legislations passed over the years, explain your wealth legislations. FACTA was one that was passed by the United States, imposing a reporting condition on banks here in Trinidad of all the persons who resided or nationals of the United States residing in this jurisdiction, earning income, owning assets. We would have passed our financial intelligence unit legislation. We would have passed in 2019 our beneficial ownership designations for companies. Revenue Authority is another one of those. All in the effort of compliance and knowing your customer, basically. And so in this age of compliance, we have seen a progression from manual to TT BizLink, now to CROS registration. And so that basically is, in a nutshell, how we arrived at the CROS system.
Represent a change in the status quo from what obtained previously.
Right. So previously, anybody could have been appointed a director, persons could have been appointed shareholders without having to provide any form of identification. So documents could have just been passed over the counter without really any type of accountability. There's a radical shift with the CROS system now in that everyone utilizing the Companies Registry system, whether it be existing companies or new persons seeking to set up businesses, shareholders, directors, agents, everybody has to be registered on the CROS system. And each individual person has to have what we call a Companies Registry account with a separate personal identification number. And so before you could even get onto the system, that is the starting point. And so to get onto the CROS system, you certainly have to have two forms of ID. You have to have a birth certificate if you're a national of this country. If you're a foreign national, you must have a birth certificate as well. You have to do, there's a new compliance requirement where you have to take a headshot of yourself holding one of those IDs. You have to provide an address, email, phone number. If you're a married person, a married woman, and your name is different from what is on your birth certificate, you have to add in your marriage certificate as well. So it's a really deep dive into private information, never before seen in this jurisdiction. And some of which I believe there will be some legislative changes to accommodate that as well. And so, like I said, completely radically different. Another example of how different it could be is that in the past, any director could have filled out a change of director, change of secretary. And so if you have 5 or 6 directors who are not aware of what's happening, they could be off the board of directors and don't even know. Majority shareholders could become minority shareholders because they're just not aware of what's been happening. But the system now is designed that any transaction that happens on that company account notifies every director, every secretary, every shareholder of those changes that are happening in the company. And so it's a way of eradicating fraud in particular in that context. It's very useful for persons who are involved in criminal investigations in the context of previously, if I had to find out who owned a company, I had to have specific information beforehand, so I knew where to go and look. With this new system, and because of the personal accounts, I can now search the registry by individual. And so if I'm trying to find out if there are cross interlocking directorships, if there are persons that have been hiding assets in companies, because again, that's separate and distinct legal entity. It's a way of detecting that hidden assets and all those different things. So it's very useful for us in the criminal jurisdiction. Family law is very useful as well, because of course in divorce proceedings, one party might be hiding assets, matrimonial assets, and that type of thing. So it's radically different. It has its challenges, but radically different. It is welcomed. We've been clamoring for some of these changes for some years now. So, yeah, gone are the days of this manual handing forms over. A lot could go wrong with that type of system. So it makes the users of the system very accountable.
What is the procedure for registering a business on CROS?
All right, so as I alluded to early on, somebody who, let's say, for instance, has an existing company or somebody new would require this company's registry account. And so the first process is, of course, you go onto the website. My advice is to make sure, having been appraised of what the requirements are, have those requirements near at hand, because if you don't have one piece of information to move on, you have to start the whole process over. So you are required to have 2 forms of ID, an email account, a cell phone contact or telephone contact. You must have your birth certificate, very important. And as I said, excluding for married persons, married women must have their marriage certificate. And so you fill out an application form online. You provide the headshot as well, and you're then registered on CROS. My advice to all persons using CROS is that you must be consistent in all of your information, because what you put in, rubbish out, it could lead to problems down the end. Because, for instance, if you put Glencoe Carnage as part of your address, I'm using an example, in one area, but then in another area you just put Glencoe, there then arises inconsistencies in the registration documents, which leads to problems at the bank and many other different areas. And so, yeah, that's the process more or less for individuals. For companies that need to be registered on the system, all of the directors and secretary are required to be registered on the system first before the company is allowed to have its own company registry account. And then after you've acquired those particular registrations, you then have to configure your company registration account to be associated with a company account. And then for any transaction you want to do thereafter, whether it be you want to appoint someone as a director, you want to appoint them as a secretary, or some type of share transfer documentation, you must then apply for approval for that specific rule before then you're allowed to do anything on the system. So it's like I say, it ring fences, it puts in all of the checks and balances to ensure that the proper procedure is followed in the context of registering, not only registering businesses, but the post-registration requirements. There's one other thing on the sole traders also. I believe as of yesterday, they launched the electronic signature. So we are almost at the stage where you can almost do a complete registration virtually without having to go in. So you can start to finish and then collect your documents at the end. But I guess they will announce that in due season. But we're almost there.
That's excellent. At this point, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Sheldon, before the break, you were just giving us an idea of how a company can be registered or incorporated on the CROS system. At this point now, I want to shift gears a bit, and I want you to tell us what challenges have you or your clients experienced using CROS?
So Colin, as with anything new, there will be challenges. Especially when you did not have the opportunity to run systems side by side. The new system running side by side with the old system. Persons may recall sometime in December of last year, the Companies Registry advised, and the Registrar General's Department would have advised that the Companies Registry system became inoperative, for the want of a better term, and between December and February of this year, no one was allowed to utilize the system. So there were no registrations of companies, no filing of post-registration documents, no registration of sole traders, nothing. And so trying to start a system from scratch in February to now, they've had some problems, some difficulties, but in the main, I think they're getting better and better each day. But some of the problems that we would have had, of course, would be some of the nuances of this new system, how the system works, some of the requirements in filling out forms. You may not meet it to the T in the context of how they would want information put in. So you may get a query here. So it is learning the system. The challenge is really just learning the system, getting to know the system. After making mistakes in one or two applications, you will then understand, okay, why this needs to be done in a particular way. So the users of the system then begin to understand the whole terminology, the whole ethos of why the system is the way it is. And so, yeah, we've had many problems. Sometimes clients taking pictures of the IDs, the information on the ID is not readable. One told us it had to be readable. It was just for the purposes of being able to identify. But for the purposes of taking your headshot, it must be, even though it's next to your face, you must be able to read it. So if you're taking a picture for yourself, you have to flip the picture so it is readable. There are some issues in the context of filling all the forms. They have specific terms that ought to be used. And if the user is not on CORA, when you use the wrong term, so documents have to be done over. You go down to the Companies Registry expecting to get the registration, and then they tell you, no, this is wrong, change it here, change it here. You do it, and then you go down, you meet somebody else who is at the counter, who you didn't speak to before, and they have a different set of criteria. And so those types of inconsistencies plague the system in the early days. But as I said, they are getting better. There are some amendments we need to make, but in due season.
As we get ready to wrap up, Sheldon, do you have any suggestions for improvement?
Certainly. As I said, alluded to before, the old TT BizLink system made it a little simpler for users who were not on CORA with the terminologies in the Companies Act. And so, for instance, let's say I'll use an example. The Articles of Incorporation has a section for the person who is signing the document, the statement, they must state, of course, that they are a director in the company, and of course state their address and so forth. But on other sections of the page, as well as in other forms, they have to sign that form as incorporator. So if someone not knowing what to put where, they make mistakes, and that slows up the system. So in the old TT-based link system, those pieces of information were filled out for you. So all you have to do is just sign in the correct position. So they could bring back that auto-filling of the statement and the different forms. Also, they need to have broader categories for companies. Some of the options there are quite limited, and it does not cater for the nuances in business. They certainly have to work on their payment portal. I know right now, as of yesterday, you had to go and pay money on an account down on the Companies Registry to have it loaded onto the account before you could then do transactions. We're in the digital age, and so hopefully we can have a proper working payment portal. They need also to have a system to notify agents of what is happening in the system. So if we apply for name approval, the name approval does not come to us advising that the name has been approved. It goes to the applicant. And so as agent, we are sometimes left in the dark. Unless we are following up, things could just be laying, waiting to be picked up by us. And so those are some of the things, basic things, like I said. Perhaps with the upgrades to come, we would see those changes. And that's it more in a nutshell. It's here. Companies Registry is here to stay. We have no choice but to get on board. We must learn to do things differently. Trinidadians like to break the rules. If things don't work the way they want it to work, we hem, we haul, we quarrel. But at the end of the day, we have to comply. And so, that's where we are, Colin.
Well, Mr. Sheldon Paul Mycoo, attorney at law, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for stopping by.
Grateful, Colin. Always good seeing you.
Thank you for listening to the Legal Corner podcast series. For more information, please visit us at our Facebook or Instagram pages or send your comments to thelegalcornerpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.